Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Cropper, Dean of the Centre for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art. And on behalf of the trustees of the gallery, I want to welcome you to this, our fifth Wyeth Lecture in American Art. Some years ago, the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, which already supported a Wyeth pre-doctoral fellow here at CASVA, proposed that we develop a series of programs to bring outstanding new scholarship in American art to a national audience. We devised a program together in which a lecture by a distinguished scholar in the field would alternate annually with a conference in which emerging scholars could present their work. The program has flourished, I'm happy to say, and now that we're able to bring Wyeth lectures to an even wider public through podcasts and even video podcasts, we feel that we're truly honoring the Wyeth memory by supporting scholarship in American art. Our choice of lecturer this year, I'm also happy to say, was an easy one. When we polled the younger members of our community of fellows, past and present, Brian Wolf's name came at the top of everyone's list. The breadth of his appeal has much to do with his engagement in the wider field of the humanities and the way in which he's brought his knowledge of literature and religion to bear on American art. Brian Wolf received his BA from Rice in 1969, his MA in religion from the Yale Divinity School in 1971, and his PhD in American Studies at Yale in 1977. After teaching at Yale for some 26 years, he was persuaded to decamp to Stanford University, where he serves as the Jeanette and William Hayden Jones Professor in American Art and Culture. Like several other high-tech, highly competitive, and largely scientific institutions, Stanford University has realized that creativity is multidimensional and that the arts are an essential part of a liberal education. And I think of the story of Steve Jobs' interest in calligraphy courses at Reed College as I say this. In Palo Alto, Brian Wolf has served as the inaugural co-director of the Stanford Arts Initiative and the Stanford Institute for Creativity and the Arts. Professor Wolf is the author of many books and has held many awards, and I'll single out just his Vermeer and the Invention of Seeing of 2001 and Romantic Revision, Culture and Consciousness in 19th Century American Painting and Literature, which was really a landmark publication in 1982. And I single them out because they exemplify his way of seeing paintings, as he puts it, as loquacious artifacts. He's never backed away from the proposition that paintings are visual texts demanding to be read through the active participation of the viewer. His deep commitment to such careful reading does not inhibit spontaneous response. So this is where Eakins begins, he glimpsed as he looked at paintings by Vermeer. His passionate commitment to enlightenment in both the historical and personal sense has led to his recent book project, The Dream of Transparency, focusing on the origins of liberal belief in the 18th century and ending with chapters on Philip Guston and Martin Puryear. So this is where Guston begins, might be his response to the Hudson River School. And that's what he will suggest to us today, or I think he will. Please welcome Brian Wolf, who will speak on Between the Lines, Philip Guston, and Bad Painting. Thank you.
You reach a certain age where nothing happens in the lecture until the reading glasses come out. I want to thank Elizabeth for that very generous and very sort of thorough introduction. I truly appreciate it. I want to thank other people here at CASVA, the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts, to Peter Lukart, Teresa O'Malley, who have made it all possible, Elizabeth Kilpinski, for me to be here today. And I want to thank each and every one of you for showing up this afternoon. You've defied a rather somber afternoon, and you've done so in the name of beauty. And I wish that if each of us could only do this every day in our lives, I suspect the world would be a much nicer place to live in. So thank you. Let's see. Okay. On the second page of Maus, Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel about his father, a survivor of Nazi imprisonment at Auschwitz, Spiegelman pays quiet tribute to a different sort of father, to Philip Guston, whose cartoon-like figurative paintings of the 1970s, let me make sure there we go, okay, whose cartoon-like figurative paintings of the 1970s served as a precedent for his own. The panel shows a foot pressing down upon the pedal of an exercise bike. The shoe and leg, severed visually from the father's unseen body, resonate with the many shoes, soles, and feet that glide through unceremoniously through Philip Guston's body of work. They suggest not only Spiegelman's debt to Guston, but Spiegelman's deeper reading of Guston as more than the maker of witty, cartoon-inspired paintings. They link Guston's late figurative canvases to Spiegelman's own topic, the Holocaust, and in this way provide a cogent frame for reinterpreting a painter whose comic images tend to be understood more as a reaction to the modernist painting than as a covert response to World War II. A little more than 2 decades later, in 1997, Spiegelman again ensconces Guston in his pantheon of predecessors by featuring Guston's oft-repeated image of himself, which we see on the left here, as an ovoid-shaped face with furrowed brow and overlarge eye in a lithograph that Spiegelman creates that is anxious about what Spiegelman feared was the impending death of cartooning in America. The subtitle of Maus, Volume 1, My Father Bleeds History, conjures an image of history as a vital, if unacknowledged, undercurrent pulsing beneath the surface of everyday events. Spiegelman drives home the point in the long horizontal panel that appears directly above the image of the father's pedaling foot. We see the artist narrator, who is drawn, as all Jews are in Spiegelman's text, as a mouse. We see the artist's father here framed. We see the artist narrator. So let me go back to right here. We see Spiegelman framed visually between the forearms of his father, who pedals on his exercise bike while talking to his son. We should note 2 things about this image. The uncommented numbers on the father's left arm, reminders of the camps, and the crosshatching that unites the father's arms with the handlebar and renders the two, arms and handlebar, a rectangular frame that surrounds the son's head. Spiegelman is framed and bound by the father's story, literally contained by it. But only we as viewers can see the framing. We are witnessing history as it bleeds, virtually unacknowledged, into everyday life, from past to present, from father to son, from one generation to another. That bleeding is present also in the figurative paintings of Philip Guston. It can be seen in the blood-like markings that appear unexplained on his hooded figures. It can be seen in the assorted feet that drag behind his cruising characters, a token of history and the past as they are carried into the present. And it can be And it can be seen in a painting like Pyramid and Shoe of 1977, where the permanence and immobility of the pyramid on the left is counterpointed with the transience and ephemerality of the shoe on the right. We might think of each of these objects, pyramid and shoe, as alternative versions of history. The former defined by its monumentality and endurance, and the latter characterized by its banality and everydayness. To understand Guston, we must begin with that shoe. For Guston's art resists transcendence. His cartoon-like figures renounce immortality for a good pair of boots. And yet they too bleed history. For even as they tread carefully through life's follies, they bear witness to something beyond themselves. That boot recalls the mounds of shoes found at Auschwitz in 1945, and again at Dachau and Bergen-Belsen. It anticipates later monuments to the Holocaust, like the one in Budapest, where Jews were once lined up along the Danube and asked to remove their shoes before being shot. And it appears again uncommented towards the end of Maus, Volume 1, when Spiegelman's father, Vladek, fending off Nazi capture in the 1940s, is directed to a hidden room concealed behind a large pile of shoes, as you see in the bottom left image here. That shoe in Pyramid and Shoes thus suggests its opposite, not just the contrast between Guston's history and more monumental versions, but the competition between the two. By placing Shoe and Pyramid equally along the horizon line, Guston in effect monumentalizes his shoe, setting it against the pyramid as its rival and alternative. In the process, Guston provides us with our first hint of what bad painting, his term for his own art, might entail. Bad painting is what happens when history ruptures impossibly, when traditional narratives splinter into fragments and eloquence gives way to cartooning. That shoe is bad painting, not because it is poorly described, but because it marks the limits of painting, the most that can be said in a world without transcendence. So let's backtrack to where we began today. I would like to suggest that we pursue the insight that Spiegelman has offered us and enter the door that Maus has opened. Our journey this afternoon will carry us from comedy to tragedy, from cartooning to crematoria. In the process, we must learn, as Guston did, how to attend to surfaces that bleed, how to find history where others have only seen flatness, how, in effect, to read between the lines. 1. Let's begin this afternoon with an odd comparison. I'm wondering in what ways Philip Guston's figurative paintings of the 1970s, on the left, resonates with a tradition of landscape from the previous century. Guston's painting Frame of 1976 may seem at first very far removed from classical 19th century Hudson River School paintings, like, for example, Asher B. Durand's Kindred Spirits of 1849. Where Guston fills his canvas with the broad, flat color masses of abstract expressionism, Durand revels in the details of trees and rocks and water. Where Guston's painting stresses the two-dimensional surface of the picture plane, Durand creates a three-dimensional space that moves illusionistically into the background, ascending as it recedes. Where Guston places a picture frame at the center of his canvas, Durand bestows upon the viewer a world of light and space, nature rather than culture. And yet, I would like to suggest, Guston's late figurative paintings, hovering somewhere between urban comedy and high modernist malaise, are unthinkable without the sort of Hudson River School painting that makes artists like Durand possible. Note the three key elements to Frame: a tactile foreground world of water, a blackened and abstracted background, and at the center, at the point of intersection between these two realms, a framed picture that not only internalizes the upper and lower divisions of the world surrounding it, but functions as a point of convergence, a space of epiphany or revelation, an endpoint to the viewer's visual quest through the canvas. But that is just what Kindred Spirits is about. a transition from foreground to background in a visual quest towards a moment of spiritual insight, given to us in the language of light and space, and in the figure of a small bird set into the sky, an embodiment of flight and transcendence, right there. Durand finds meaning in nature, while Guston sets his more modernist sights upon art itself as a source of salvation. In his Wharf, again from 1976, Guston inverts the color scheme of frame while drawing attention to the saving power of art. The blues are at the top of the canvas this time, and the blacks occupy the lower foreground. Guston constructs his wharf, his harbor against the tides, from elements of his own life. The easel and canvas on the right, the head of his wife Musa to its left, and the recurrent Guston images, shoes, feet, horseshoes, occasionally scrap metal, what Guston called his crapola, filling out the rest of the wharf. As he does in frame, Guston seems to be telling us, in a manner at once comic and stoic, that painting serves as a buoy, as an anchor, a wharf that tethers us against the tides of life, that steadies us against death, that points us, and note that vertical easel frame reaching to the skies, towards heaven. Art, in other words, is Guston's redemption. And redemption, in turn, emerges in a language of quest and epiphany, that easel pointing towards the heavens, that we know most familiarly from Hudson River School paintings like Durand's. Lest we miss the point, go back to 1969 and 70, when Guston first scandalized the New York art world by renouncing abstraction and returning not just to figuration, but to a very cartoonish vision that mixed Ku Klux Klan hoods, idioms of popular culture, and a private vocabulary of cigars, light bulbs, legs, shoes, and other assorted and often hairy body parts. Dawn of 1970 presents two hooded artist figures, their identities always masked, their Klan-like masks always suggesting the artist's involuntary complicity in a world of suffering and pain. Guston's dual figures resemble nothing so much as Durand's two Catskill questers, one holding a cigar rather than a pilgrim staff, the other pointing towards that round orange globe of the sun. Guston's artist carries with him more historical baggage than Durand's figures. We can see protruding from the back of the car what might be a painter's easel, a parallel to Cole's sketch pad in Kindred Spirits, and a series of dismembered feet, an allusion to the death of his brother from a car accident that had crushed his feet. Those feet serve as well as a reminder that we are all earthbound and flat-footed, dragging our mortality behind us wherever we go. Despite this baggage, Guston's artist heads, like Durand's figure, to a promise of dawn, a sense of new beginnings that Guston gives us in the figure of the sun, a visual foil on the left side of the canvas for the images of mortality on the right, trailing from behind the car. That sun is not a realistic representation of what suns actually look like. Rather, it functions as an emblem, borrowed from Hudson River School painting and plopped down smack in the middle of a late 20th century canvas. It represents two things: Guston's homage to his landscape predecessors and his need to beg, steal, or borrow their symbols for his art. Only notice the telephone poles that frame the artist's journey. They remind us that 20th century urban culture now separates us from nature, a nature represented in the painting in the orb of the sun and the clustering of birds on the telephone line at the left. Nature, in other words, is framed by culture, by the signs of urban life. It is not so much a real world of birds and sky that Guston gives us, but a utopian construction, a way of representing transcendence from within the world of 20th century urban history. Guston's painting, in other words, reaches back to 19th century landscape conventions, in order both to affirm a continuity with and to acknowledge the differences between their world and our own. Guston thus allies his quest with Hudson River School painting at the same time as he distinguishes it as an urban enterprise, a modernist adventure, in which nature exists as nothing more than a symbol, a rounded orange orb for where he, as a mid-20th century painter, wishes to go. If we let our eyes drift to the right of Guston's painting, we discover what looks like an easel leaning out from the back of the car. And I'm talking about this with the lines coming off there. This is the only occasion in Dawn when Guston repeats the color orange. This is Guston's way of linking art to nature, painting and sun, his concession to the recurring power of landscape imagery in our culture, even when nature is understood only as a fiction of transcendence, in a world desperate to escape all that those framing telephone lines represent: modern life, a sense of enclosure, and an intimation of death, visible in the trailing limbs. Dawn thus refuses the very transcendence it pursues. The painting provides Guston instead with a genealogy, a way of burrowing into the past and coming up with a visual tradition and art history to call his own. It's a way of short-circuiting, we might say, the dogmas surrounding abstract painting by inventing or conjuring up an alternative visual tradition, a way of defeating critics like Clement Greenberg, the high priest of post-war painting in America, by invoking works and visions from an earlier moment in American history. It does so not by repeating the formula of 19th century art, but by inverting them. We encounter nature only as a fantasy, and we forego the moment of epiphany for the quixotic pleasures of the quest. But a painting like Dawn, with its quiet nod to the 19th century, represents only one voice within Guston's complicated story. To understand Guston more fully, we need to attend to other voices as well. Let's talk for a moment about books. 2. It peeks out from the lower center of the painting, a rectangle of pinkish white surrounded by the curved forms of what appear to be horseshoes. And I'm referring right here. Some of the horseshoes morph into reddish rectangles and ovals that suggest the soles of shoes. Each shoe is outlined by a series of small black circles that stand in Guston's recurring iconography for nails. Together, the horseshoes and soles form a rounded mound that curves upward from left to right, over here, like a small foothill, literally, since they are related to the exposed feet behind them. Or perhaps they swell gently like another of Guston's frequent motifs, the Earth's horizon. Directly above them, a band of skinny feet straddles a red brick wall. And directly above the feet, at the top of the canvas, a layer of thickly applied black pigment suggests both sky and void. Together, Guston's spaces form 3 distinct planes: a bottom tier of shoes, a middle row of feet, and above and behind that evacuated sky. If this were a Hudson River School landscape, we would be looking at foothills in the foreground, mountains, those vertical feet, and sky. Examined more formally, Ancient Wall calls to mind the hovering planes in a late Rothko painting, bands of color floating upon a shared ground. Only Guston's quiet homage to Rothko turns unexpectedly rude. Rothko's ethereal spaces have been replaced by uncouth body parts. Guston reimagines Rothko's world of abstract forms as a scene of dangling legs and comically mundane objects. Even worse, the high-mindedness of abstract painting. Rothko's desire for what Guston referred to uncomfortably as purity dissolves in Guston's canvas into the profane forms of comic books and mass culture. What remains is flatness, Flat feet, flat-footedness, a flat wall. It's as if the two-dimensional properties of the canvas, a source of almost religious zeal among American painters of the late 40s and 1950s, have become, in Guston's hands, a bad visual joke, grotesque, puzzling, and in your face. At the far right of the canvas, a flattened leg has been nailed to the wall. There is no kneecap to mark the leg as human or to hint at the climbing activity that has brought it, like the other legs to its left, over the wall. It hangs instead like a crucified slab of bacon, pierced and immobilized. The activities that energize Guston's painting, that upward thrust of the mound of shoes, the reach of the legs bending over the wall, the hint of a landscape and a journey, come to a forced halt on the right. If walls are things to be climbed, and feet are instruments for that climbing, then Guston's nailed foot signals an abrupt end to whatever dream of transcendence lies behind or might empower those hairy legs. Back then to that small rectangle of pinkish white with which we began. It is not a horseshoe. It represents instead a book within Guston's world of recurring objects. Compare it, for example, to Guston's drawing of a book. Note also that it sits directly below what looks like a painting in Guston's elusive rendering. A stretched canvas, again that rectangle of pinkish white, with a nail binding canvas to stretcher. Book and painting reinforce each other, forming together a self-consciously aesthetic space within Guston's otherwise comically mundane world. In the far right corner of the painting, an eyeball, right here, peers out from the bottom edge of the canvas, a recurring image for Guston of introspection and self-awareness. It gazes up into the mound of shoes, soles, nails, and feet, a stand-in for the viewer facing the canvas. If we think of that eyeball less as a metaphor for seeing, which of course it is, and more as a mode of spying, which its corner position and upturned gaze also suggest, then we find ourselves suddenly in the midst of a mystery, a puzzle to be solved. From this vantage, the painting and the book at the lower center of the canvas take on qualities of hiddenness. They emerge from a mass of forms that they resemble but also differ from. And they hint at a thematics of writing, that book, allied with painting, that we must understood as hidden, submerged, and only partially visible. We could use a Freudian discourse here to say that what we are witnessing is a not very successful act of repression, an effort to bury something that is different or perhaps disturbing to the larger economy of the painting. Or perhaps we should refine our observations to say that we are viewing instead the return of the repressed, a concern with writing that partially breaches the mound of shoes around it and appears visually in disguised form. This would explain the slipperiness of what we see, the way that mundane objects like horseshoes and shoe bottoms mask or overwrite other concerns hinted at in the book and the painting. It would also explain that eye, less an object among others to be cataloged within the canvas, and more an articulation, an announcement of a logic of surveillance at play, should we say afoot, within the painting. That hidden trope of writing is picked up elsewhere in Ancient Wall in the legs that straddle the wall behind them. Seen collectively, the limbs resemble some strange hieroglyphic, an undeciphered set of letters set against a flat surface. That surface, in turn, quickly shifts from a red wall to a lined page. Its rows of black horizontal bands, thin and unwavering, transforming the wall into a writing pad, covered now with the strange alphabet of the body. Legs and limbs assembling into some mysterious script. A painting about seeing, a painting where the eye in the corner suggests introspection and self-consciousness, now becomes a painting about writing, which bleeds onto the canvas as a logic, an impulse that can't be checked. Which, of course, is one reason the canvas must be read, Or was that R-E-D, in an against-the-grain fashion? This is a painting that sets out to shield what it cannot help expressing. Let us note simply that in the larger composition of Guston's canvas, the body language of skinny feet occupies an in-between space, squeezed visually by the uprising mound of shoes in the foreground and the black plane of sky in the background. There is a now you see it, now you don't quality to the hieroglyph legs. They oscillate between feet and letters, and they appear on what is both a wall and a page. In the process, these hieroglyph letters announce writing, not only as a hidden concern of Guston's painting, but as a thematics incomprehensible except as coded and disguised, a way of writing that resists our attention. This concern with writing and textuality, set in problematic relation to vision and opticality, is located compositionally somewhere between foreground and background, eyeball and sky, ascent and descent, a defining moment within a complex visual grammar. The tensions, then, that animate ancient wall are threefold. The conflict between that which is legible and that which is not, the slippage between painting and writing, and the arrested nature of an as yet unspecified pilgrimage within the painting's landscape format. To help tie these together, To help tie these together, we need to return to Dawn in order to note a detail there that we missed the first time around. What is that hanging from the telephone wire on the right, over here? What do we make of those four squiggly forms on the underside of the phone line? They appear to be a series of unexplained, what William James would have called unmotivated, globs of paint that dangle from the phone line, abstract references to the act of painting itself. Until we remember on the left, not only two other similar drippings, but next to them that cluster of birds sitting above the wire. This is not simply paint, then, dripping innocently from the phone lines, but, and pardon my language here, bird shit. Those gobs of gray and white have been used by Guston to double ends. They suggest both the gestural brushwork of abstract expressionism, of pure painting, and the excrement of singing birds. The joke is on us. Or perhaps, to be a bit more historically minded, the joke is on Jackson Pollock, whose paint-spattered canvases now dangle in comically reduced form from Philip Guston's long horizontal line. There is an anxiety of influence here, a need on Guston's part to defeat abstract expressionism by reducing it to a comic, if unseemly, mess, dangling in the background from one of Guston's boundary-shaping lines. Guston's two hoods, as he termed his masked forms, head to the future in their unwheeled and anachronistic Model T, dragging three histories behind them: the personal allusion to Guston's brother, the tradition of 19th century landscape painting, and now a reference to post-war abstract painting in America. 3, we need to understand what writing means to Guston, why it should crouch in disguised form among all those shoes and feet, and why, when visible, it comes only in undeciphered form, as coded as a hieroglyph. The key lies in going back once more to the 19th century, this time to the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe, who more than any other American writer of the 19th century concerned himself with codes and cryptography and changes that were occurring in the antebellum period to the publishing industry, changes that affected the very nature of authorship. Poe's fiction makes no sense unless we understand the conditions facing writing in the antebellum period: the lack of an international copyright law, the rise of an everyday, what was called the penny press, the proliferation of magazines and journals of mass circulation, the birth of a culture industry tied to the circulation of information and the extension of literacy and reading into ever larger portions of the population. Our tale hinges on international copyright law. There was none in the 1830s and 40s, a gap in the legal code that allowed American publishers to steal, plagiarize, and otherwise reproduce European writing without payment and without consequence. What proved to be a boon for American publishers turned out to be a nightmare for authors like Poe. They could not sell their stories for decent fees, and they could not compete with texts that circulated freely, that is to say, both widely and without adequate payment. For Poe, then, the romantic notion of a writer garroted away somewhere with pen and paper and a vision, a writer capable of living from his labor alone, proved more of a fantasy than a reality. Poe responded to the situation in two ways. He moved frantically from one magazine job to another, serving in effect as a one-man publishing industry, all in an effort to support himself, his teenage wife, and her widowed mother. And he invented a new mode of writing. We tend to credit Poe with the creation of the detective story, the three Dupin mysteries, which set the stage for later figures like Sherlock Holmes, and those tales of ratiocination and mystery that gave birth to the modern short story. But perhaps what goes unrecognized is a different sort of writing, not the detective story, but narratives structured as if they were palimpsests. A palimpsest, you may recall, is a form of writing associated with medieval scribes. Parchment was a cherished commodity in the Middle Ages. In order to conserve the parchment on which they wrote, medieval scribes scraped away whatever text they found on older parchments, and then copied alternative text onto the now blank surface. Only the surface of a palimpsest is never actually clean. It always betrays traces of prior writing, traces that inevitably poke through the surface of the new text. A palimpsest, then, is a text that is overwritten. Its surface is always haunted by the ghost of earlier text that invariably erupt onto the surface. For Poe, the model of the palimpsest provided a way of reimagining writing in a world overrun by foreign text, a world without adequate copyright protection. Unlike the John Lockean notion of the mind as a tabula rasa, a blank slate awaiting inscription, the palimpsest instead, by contrast, conjured a world already saturated with writing, a world where new text were never actually new, but only echoes of prior text, and originality existed as nothing more than as a fiction invented by those blind to the fate of writing in the modern world. The lack of copyright turned writers into scriveners rather than prophets, copiers who did nothing more than circulate and recirculate the words, texts, and documents of others in altered form. In William Wilson, and that's the title of a short story of 1839 by Poe, a story about doubles and identity, Poe has his narrator recall the look of a classroom from his childhood. And now I'm going to quote for a moment from William Wilson. Poe's describing the room, or William Wilson's describing the room. Interspersed about the room, crossing and recrossing in endless irregularity, were innumerable benches and desks, black, ancient, and time-worn, piled desperately with much bethumbed books, and so beseamed with initial letters, names at full length, and other multiplied efforts of the knife, as to have entirely lost what little of original form might have been their portion in days long departed. William Wilson's description here is less the depiction of an antiquated schoolroom than a meditation on authorship in the early modern period. Note that those benches and desks are all facsimiles or variations on the theme of the tabula rasa, the unscarred surface that provides the starting point, the foundational moment for Lockean epistemology. But also note that they have entirely lost what little of original form might once have been their portion in days long departed. Their surfaces are filled with prior writing. For Poe, then, identity is staked to acts of writing, those initial letters and names at full length. And writing, in turn, turns out to be nothing more than the endless rearrangement of already extant texts. Poe's narrator affirms the necessarily sadistic nature of such writing. He carves out his identity, carving it into the desk, by defacing, if not wholly erasing, the signatures of those who have come before him. Writing then is at once a violent act, those multiplied efforts of the knife, and an erotic one. The desks are much bethumbed and beseamed. For Poe, the image of the palimpsest provides a model, a metaphor, for the conditions that underwrite authorship in a world without copyright, a world where text, like echoes, bounce endlessly off each other because each repeats with variation a prior utterance. The palimpsest alludes not only to a world of endlessly circulating text, but to new modes of writing, ways of constructing literature through a method of cut and paste that to 21st century eyes appear remarkably postmodern. The palimpsest, in other words, is a form of pastiche. The term describes a text or surface that is more than just a collage of prior writings. Poe's writing, like a palimpsest, is haunted by other text, inhabited by voices other than its own. And the brilliance of the story William Wilson, then, is that Poe has invented not modernity, but postmodern modes of writing, long before modernity itself had been imagined. He's replaced the romantic image of the artist as a prophet and seer, alone with his or her vision, with a far more radical account of writing as necessarily unoriginal, as a form of plagiarism in a world without blank slates, a post-Lockean universe. Farewell Locke, and farewell originality. Postmodernity begins in a classroom with blackened desks and incised surfaces in a short story by Edgar Allan Poe. Postmodernity begins with the death of the tabula rasa. 4. Which returns us to Philip Guston. Writing is important to Guston because his surfaces are palimpsests. They are haunted by forces that lurk around the edges of the canvas, by figures that climb over or around whatever is flat or planar in his art, by adumbrations of something hidden or repressed on the canvas. Writing is important to Guston because it has nothing to do with authors filling blank pages and everything to do instead with artists confronting already written texts, already narrated events that peek, poke, or prod through the surface of abstraction. If painting in the era of Jackson Pollock has been colonized by languages of abstraction and medium specificity, by an attention to the two-dimensional properties of the canvas, then writing for Guston is a way of upending all this. Because writing as palimpsest provides an alternative model. It substitutes depth for surface, the partially visible for the fully legible, and in the process it proclaims that what you see is not necessarily what you get. You see flatness, but what you get are ghosts and history and bad painting, which we can now understand as painting that behaves like writing. Painting that behaves like writing. What the palimpsest ultimately provides Guston is a model for remembering a way of understanding the past as something constructed retrospectively in the present. We might put it this way. Guston plays Poe to Pollock's Locke. His allegiance is not to flatness or abstraction or blankness, but to the many ways that one might disfigure the surface in order to recover or remember what lies beneath or behind it. 5. In Rosemary's Baby, remember that? Rosemary's Baby, Roman Polanski's haunting film of 1968, the year that Guston, we should remember, breaks from abstraction. Mia Farrow plays a pregnant young wife unaware that she is carrying the devil's baby. Early in the movie, Farrow sits down in the waiting room of her obstetrician and picks up a copy of Time magazine. The cover proclaims in bold letters, "Is God dead?" This is actually the first cover in the history of Time to forego an image and to front the reader instead with words only. This scene in Rosemary's Baby draws upon a popularized version of a set of concerns first articulated more than a decade earlier in 1951, when Frankfurt School critic Theodor Adorno famously commented, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric." Adorno's proclamation helped shape a debate in the United States and Europe in the 1950s and 60s about what sort of language was possible after the Holocaust. The debate was taken up most vigorously by Richard Rubinstein and Emil Fackenheim, both Jewish theologians, and George Steiner, one of the leading literary critics of the day. Rubinstein and Fackenheim were concerned with the death of God, a reference not to the disappearance of an actual God, but to that moment in human history when the notion of transcendence had lost plausibility. For Rubinstein, the God of transcendence died in the Holocaust. He has been replaced by what Rubinstein calls the God of holy nothingness, no longer a personal figure, but a possibility, a way of naming the numinous and the sacred that lie at the heart of all human striving, however inadequate, however fallen. Steiner, in turn, was less concerned with God than with language. In Language and Silence, his collection of essays from 1967, Steiner meditates upon what can and cannot be said in a post-Holocaust world. Can the same language that lent itself to the purposes of fascism, that debased itself by sleeping with state violence and mass extermination, can it be reconstituted in any form worth salvaging? Steiner is uncertain. He associates language in its fullness, what he terms classical language, with the best that has been said and thought in human history. Language was once coextensive with human experience. We could say what we thought, and we utilized language to bend the world to our vision. From this point of view, silence stands on the other side of language, is that which is outside or beyond rationality, order, and the moral vision of classical culture. But there is a second version of silence, one necessitated by the Holocaust. This is the silence of refusal. As Steiner cogently phrases it, we come after. 3 astonishing words. We come after. Such world historical belatedness relative to the Holocaust requires a different mode of response, a way not of speaking, but of not speaking in the face of history's savagery. Such silence stands as a protest against the cruelty and enemy of the modern world. This other silence finds voice most powerfully in writers like Samuel Beckett, and I quote Steiner here. Monsieur Beckett is moving with unflinching Irish logic toward a form of drama in which a character, his feet trapped in concrete and mouth gagged, will stare at the audience and say nothing. The imagination has supped its fill of horrors of the unceremonious trivia through which modern horror is expressed. As rarely before, poetry is tempted by silence. Steiner carries Beckett's writing to its implicit endpoint. Characters who no longer wait for Godot, but who instead stare, gagged and speechless, at the audience. Their silence is their weapon in a game of cosmic refusal. And I quote from Steiner once again. Precisely because language is the signature of his humanity, because it is that which makes of man a being of striving unrest, the word should have no natural life, no neutral sanctuary in the places and season of bestiality. Silence is an alternative. When the words in the city are full of savagery and lies, nothing speaks louder than the unwritten poem. In Steiner's world, after Auschwitz, the only honorable action we can perform is to explicate the poem we did not write. Steiner's musings on things verbal, language, speech, textuality, is balanced by his deep contempt for things visual. He refers to the paintings of Franz Klein on the left and Jackson Pollock, as you see on the right. He refers to the paintings of Klein as merely a whorl of paint. And he links Jackson Pollock to the, quote, rudimentary pleasures of decoration, characterizing Pollock's pioneering paintings as, quote, vivid wallpaper. For Steiner, modern art, what he terms at one point the realm of the graphic, has declared its independence from the word, and in the process has rendered itself susceptible to the very forces that classical language held at bay, feelings and sensations beyond morality and outside rationality. Art has prostituted itself in the 20th century to totalitarian ends. Which returns us again to Philip Guston. Let us consider Guston's figurative painting as an instance of what Steiner most feared, a mode of debased language. Guston's term for this, his way of describing his own art, as we noted, was bad painting. Guston meant in part by this that painting that sleeps willingly with the enemy, that nestles up among pop and vernacular forms, that renounces sanctity and pureness for banality and tawdriness. Badness, for Guston, is the only way we have to keep painting true to the banal, media-driven, mass cultural world that we inhabit, and true to what scholars like Robert Slifkin have called the corrupted subjectivity of modern life. And yet, if Guston's late work represents Steiner's worst nightmare, then it also contains, by virtue of its badness, one of the most formidable responses that we possess to Steiner's challenge. How is communication possible in a world after Auschwitz? We need to attend, in closing, to the capacity of badness to address, if not redeem, loss. 7. Guston made no secret of his interest in the Holocaust. After World War II, he followed closely the stories about the camps that were just emerging in the media. He focused his response on children, whom he imagined, as he later stated, quote, not as children, but as lost, agonized beings. In Porch Number 2 of 1947, painted 2 years after the close of the war, 5 children confront the viewer from the confines of a space whose flatness is reinforced by their own compressed forms. The intersection of vertical and lateral pieces of lumber at the center of the painting creates, in effect, a cross, crucifying the child at the center with the Picasso-derived face, right here. One child dangles upside down near the feet, an image suggestive of a hanging or execution. Notice the rope to the right over here. And an allusion to Guston's own father, who hanged himself in a broom closet and was discovered and cut down by the 10 or 11-year-old Guston. Together, the 3 boys in the background there, standing upright, suggest an oddly cubist version of the adage, see no evil, on the right, hear no evil, on the left, right here, and Speak No Evil, the child with the pipe-like instrument at the center. This unexpected verbal visual pun introduces the theme of denial, a point driven home by the way the background figures ignore the form hanging in their midst. Whether or not this painting addresses the Holocaust directly, it depends for its effect on imagery of entrapment and confinement, tied not only to its compressed spaces, but to the fences and barred windows that define those spaces. Porch number 2 is a painting about denial, complicity, and guilt. It marks both Guston's need to bear witness and his sense of separation from the very events that haunt him. We are left in the end with a knowing child, a dangling child, and 3 other children working very hard to refuse any relation to the upside-down figure in their midst. This is a painting not only about denial, but about cognition, what we know and what we may not have known, and when we did not know it. It marks for Guston the end of his and American innocence in a post-Holocaust world. 2 decades later, Guston hits again at the Holocaust in an image that only indirectly acknowledges its origins. In 1968, Guston had read Jean-Francois Steiner's book, Treblinka, a history by a French Jew of the concentration camp where his parents perished. Guston's response is telling, and I'm quoting Guston here. I read this, and my mind anyway starts running away with everything I read or touch or see, and I began to see all of life really as a vast concentration camp. And everybody is numbed, you know. Then I thought, well, that's the only reason to be an artist, to escape and bear witness to this. 1 year after reading Treblinka, Guston painted Blackboard of 1969, an image that is as much about ghosts as it is about the hoods that we see at the canvas's center. Guston has replaced the cubist armature of porch number 2 with a different sort of flatness, that of walls and blackboards. In the process, he introduces a new post-cubist way of talking about space, not as a series of collage-like planes, flat shapes that are pasted to other flat shapes, but through metaphors of writing. The surface of Guston's canvas has become a palimpsest. The painting transposes the loss of innocence that we observed in porch number 2 into a discourse about writing, and in the process replaces the two-dimensional Lockean surface of abstract expressionism with a haunted surface, subject to memory and erasure. Blackboard directs the viewer's attention to a surface inhabited literally by 3 ghosts, images of a past that refuses to stay past. Guston paints over forms in the lower left foreground, here, that might once have been benches or desks, allowing the canvas to highlight through its vigorous brushstroke its own failed erasures. Those earlier forms, whatever objects they might once have been, push through Guston's brushstrokes, through his brushwork, insisting, even in their illegibility, that we acknowledge them. Note especially the role played by lines in the painting. The dotted lines on Guston's 3 hoods, the lines that you see here, hinting at an undisclosed blueprint or pattern that informs their shape, lines that also, by their very arbitrariness, undercut any order that they might suggest. Then there's a narrow line that runs along the inside perimeter of the blackboard, highlighting the framed quality of the image. And then there's that long, unexplained black line that runs along the length of the canvas at the top. All of these lines stand in tension with the painterly quality of Guston's surface, with its thickly applied brushstrokes. And yet that surface itself coalesces into a recurring pattern of rectilinear forms. You see everywhere here these implicit rectangles in the paintings, on the painting surface. These are squares and rectangles that suggest an effort to order, to bind, to contain something. Those ghosts, for example. that might otherwise overwhelm the painting surface. Those lines both delimit the abyss, the void of history, at the same time as they permit some deeper, darker mystery to be whispered. They allow us, as Moses was once permitted, to see God and live. Only it is not God that we are talking about, but something else, something Guston needs to paint out while still calling our attention to what he can't show. Blackbird, in other words, represents Guston's meditation on painting as an act of writing. And writing for Guston is not a Lockean activity of fresh beginnings, but a Gothic enterprise of echoes and memories. Guston's model for this, as we noted, is the palimpsest, which provides Guston with a way to reimagine painting beyond the language of flatness. The canvas or surface is always already haunted, not only with the ghost of precursors like Picasso or Pollock, but by something which now at last we can name. Guston is haunted by history with a capital H, and Blackboard bears witness to that haunting. It is a painting about three things: history's intrusion upon the present, hence those ghosts; the fragility of memory, that metaphor of erasure; and finally, the machinery by which we remember, the palimpsest. Guston needs the palimpsest because its language of a present invaded by the past, of text disrupted by earlier text, provides him with a way of understanding his own situation. We might interpret that small rectangle on the wall to the right of the blackboard, right here, in three ways. One, as a painting within a painting, a stand-in for abstraction, a flat, textured surface that provides a foil for, a contrast with, the world of figuration to the left. Two, as a reminder that pure painting is never finally pure, that it must yield ultimately, as Guston believed, to images, to figuration, to the haunting of history that we see at the center of Blackboard. And three, as the loser in a Bloomian contest between alternative visions of painting, flatness and abstraction on the right, and figuration at the canvas's center. The smallness of the rectangle on the right, relative to the largeness of the blackboard at the center, represents Guston's way of measuring the diminished stature of abstraction in a world compelled by other needs, the need to bear witness, for example, and the painter's obligation to tell ghostly stories. For that is what blackboards are about, spaces where writing can occur and where figuration finds sanction. Blackboards belong to classrooms, and we are Guston's pupils, learning from his world of lines and erasures how to remember. The question then is what to remember. 8. In Outskirts, and I'm coming to a conclusion now, in Outskirts, painted in 1969, the same year as Blackboard, Guston ventures as close as he will ever get to a direct image of the Holocaust. The painting brings together two motifs that reappear in Guston's painting until his death. The first is the conversation among faceless figures, that congress of hoods, whose world of violence, and Guston has scraped out the whip held by the hood to the right of center. That world of violence continues long after Guston stops painting the hooded figures themselves. And the second, at the top of the painting, is a group of architectural forms with black slits for windows, an image that Guston paints and repaints throughout the 1970s. In the space in between, that middle ground realm of red, we see a small black train. I can't help but read Outskirts as a narrative of the camps. From the sadism and violence of the human figures in the foreground, to the engine dragging a freight car filled with what or whom in the middle ground, to the destination point, those buildings whose outsized scale suggest an equally outsized level of horror in the beholder. And there on the right, in the smaller pink building behind the dominant red structure, right here, What do we see in the right angle brushstroke rising dramatically from its roof but the suggestion of smoke? The truest, saddest sign that we have entered the realm of bestiality and history. Note the reference again the following year to smoke and crematoria in Flatlands of 1970, where the chimney and billowing smoke in the brick structure in the upper right remind us not only of the camps, but as the hand pointing at the top of the canvas insists on the need to remember them. And yet the point, finally, is not one of content. It's not how Guston depicted the camps, which he rarely did, but of something larger, something tied to the very notion of history itself and how we preserve it. So let's conclude today by talking about talking, the title of this painting. Painted 1 year before his death, Talking of 1979 shows a gesturing arm and hand. The hand points to the right while cradling not one but 2 cigarettes. A red trail of smoke puffs rises from one of the cigarettes before falling gloriously, voluminously to the center bottom of the canvas, while circles of orangish beads form what might be the metal cord leading to an unseen light bulb. A very Gustonian watch points with its one hand to the left, a Baroque counterpoint to the gesture of the hand itself to the right. Talking, as a painting, is defined by paradox. It is about the very activity that painting as a visual form cannot communicate. It suggests speech that we cannot hear. We could say this is a painting about language and referentiality, that all discourse, all sign-making, all painting can finally achieve nothing greater than to gesture beyond itself. This could be about painting about transcendence then, except that in its egregious refusal to suggest what it is pointing towards, talking pulls our attention away from where it points to what it is, to the gesture itself, to that hand defined by a watch, a chain, a cascade of smoke, and a thumb set perpendicularly against the fingers. This is a painting about painting and its limits. But it is also a painting about painting and its glories. For if you look closely, you will notice that the thumb and index finger form the edge of a frame, right here. They create a right angle that suggests the corner of a picture. And in the process, they suggest a painting within a painting that consists of 2 smoking cigarettes, a rising and then cascading plume of smoke, and the void. That picture within a picture distills the essence of Guston's late figurative art. It is autobiographical. Guston was a chain smoker. It is painterly. The forms are quasi-abstract and quasi-gestural. And it recapitulates an image like pyramid and shoe, with which we began, painted 2 years earlier. It sets 2 man-made forms, those 2 cigarettes, against the void. It asks us to contrast their erect forms with the nothingness they set off and perhaps redeem. And it redefines yet again bad painting, suggesting this time that bad painting takes the most trivial and banal of objects and pins our hopes for immortality upon them. As we gaze at the smoke rising and then descending, we need to remember the lines that end Sunday morning, Wallace Stevens' poem of 1915, lines which simultaneously lament and exalt our fated lives as we, like Guston's puffs of smoke, drift, quote, downward to darkness on extended wings. Downward to darkness on extended wings. And the Holocaust? It's there not as the subject of Guston's painting, but as its enabling condition. I'm not referring to the possible echo between smoke and crematoria, nor to the ascending pull string that reaches towards an absent God, nor to the watch which suggests in the backward sweep of its only hand a past which cannot be forgotten, nor to the cascading smoke that rises first for one framed and glorious moment before descending, a model of the true pathos of art making itself, nor even to the blackness which surrounds all in silence. I'm referring instead to talking as a meta-painting, a meditation on paradox and impossibility, with its hint that the true subject of painting, another reason it is bad, cannot be spoken, that we cannot hear what the painting wishes to but never can say directly. This is a painting not about the Holocaust, but about bearing witness. And it is also Guston's way of reimagining the trope of the palimpsest, not this time as a disfigured surface, but as an endlessly recurring gesture, that pointing hand forever mocking the void. What can painting as an enterprise provide us? What can it provide us with but smoke and fire and void? And the answer, for the question is not rhetorical, is a frame. That right angle of thumb and index finger seizes chaos and banality and horror, the forces that Steiner most dreaded, and molds them into a shape, into a meaning, into a framed image, into art. For that is where the Holocaust dwells for Guston, not in the telling, which can never be adequately heard, but in the framing, which is what painting provides. Thank you.
Before we go to the reception, that Brian Wolf has agreed to answer a couple of questions, if anybody would like to raise a hand. Yes, is that Joshua back there?
So I really enjoyed this last hour a lot. It made me like Guston more than I ever have before. And I think ending on this painting worked extremely well. There are a couple of questions, though, that I have sort of about a formulation. One is how much you really want to hold on to the figure that the palimpsest is actually postmodernist. Because of course you're drawing it from ancient sources. And the second question, which I think maybe is a little bit more to the heart of the talk, is just whether you have anything more you want to make of the sort of formal badness of the painting. I mean, the kind of cruddiness or the crudeness of the finish, which is the part that, for my eye, was in all these very lush accounts of the pictures, was never quite enough brought into account. Just that the badness of the sort of, not just their cartooniness, but their sort of lousy cartooniness. And part of why that interests me so much is because it seems to me that it's actually been really formative to a lot of art since. A lot of contemporary art is a little bit Guston-like, that particular quality of badness. And I just wonder what you say.
Well, okay. So this is a question. Could everybody hear that? Should I repeat that? Okay. Yes, repeat? Well, I will repeat, right. The question is really a two-part question, and the first is, would I want to stay with the very term palimpsest as a postmodern term given its historical origins way beyond what we term postmodernity? And the second part had to do with Guston's language of badness and addressing not badness as a question of content, simply the cartooniness of the images, but badness as something formal, something crude in the way the cartoons are made and how one might pursue that. Is that a sort of, okay. So the first to the sort of simpler question in a way about the palimpsest, for me, the issue actually finally is not an historical one in the sense of it goes back many centuries. For me, the issue of the palimpsest as postmodern is in its contrast with the tabula rasa. That it seems to me that language of innocence, fresh beginnings of artistic vision, the ability to shape and order a world, that all to me is one part of a Lockean discourse that Guston marks an end to. And the palimpsest I associate with forms that come after that, with the sense of texts that are never clean, that are never original, that are always haunted. So in that way, palimpsest for me is actually a very powerful term, because it lets us know that the surface is always haunted by forces erupting through that surface, forces that we need to listen to, but that may not be directly articulated. The second question about the sort of the crudeness of Guston's painting is a really interesting sort of observation, and I greatly appreciate your point. So let me say two things briefly. One, as you know, Guston sort of made his reputation as an abstract expressionism with these red, pink sorts of canvases. I've never appreciated them. They've always seemed to me to be sort of really second-rate painting. And yet, ironically, it seems to me, Guston's greatness as an abstract expressionist is in his figurative art. And by in his figurative art, I don't mean the figures, I mean the incredible texture of the surface. It's as if figuration liberated Guston to fall in love with the surface and to paint accordingly in ways that I think abstraction, that earlier phase, actually did not allow. He was held in at that moment. But two, in terms of the crudeness, I mean, I think your point is absolutely right, and we'll take in, and I would actually like to hear you continue in the sense of sort of what the progeny would be of that crudeness. For Guston, I think, it was a way of trying to say, there is no purity anymore. It's part of that Steiner world we come after. And in coming after, you don't paint with the finesse and delicacy that you once did, because this is not a world that can support that.
There's one at the back, if you could just shout.
I would second the first question. There's comments about new appreciation from Philip Guston. I had a question about the shoe and pyramid image.
Oh, yes.
The idea of the shoe as the icon and as sort of a counter history to the pyramid. I was struck when you first put up that slide. I was expecting to hear more about the sort of pair of shoes as an icon in art history of a sort of, as in history specifically, I'm thinking about, Van Gogh.
Exactly.
Famous, story of the origin of the work of art. You had a comment sort of on that, blood and soil history.
Right. That's an excellent and very important point. I mean, Guston is not only referencing the sort of forces we talked about, he's referencing the history of art, and he does this throughout all his art, in particular Van Gogh's very famous image of the peasant shoes. One could, it simply, there was not world enough in time to go into that dimension of Guston's work. Guston was deeply influenced by a variety of earlier modernisms and ultimately by the Renaissance, Piero in particular. And he is continually reimagining that sort of long history of art history as a history that informs his own work, and grappling with how to address that at the same time as grappling with what I think are the issues that we talked about today. So it's all there. It just wasn't in the 50 minutes or 55 minutes I had.
Well, Brian, I think we have to have you
Okay.
back from your Guston. But
Thank you.
I would like to invite everybody in the audience to come and join us in the reception room upstairs after this wonderful talk.
Okay,
Thank you so
thank
much.
you.